In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a reclusive writer, Leonard Grayson, is found dead in his burned cottage, a bullet in his chest and his unpublished masterpiece reduced to ashes. Was it an accident or a calculated murder? Enter Miss Jane Marple, the sharp-eyed spinster who sees what others miss. As whispers of a scandalous manuscript swirl, for suspects emerge: an ambitious editor, a desperate agent, a resentful son, and a nosy neighbor. Each hides a secret, but only one pulled the trigger. With a missing gun and a trail of lies, Miss Marple unravels a deadly web of plagiarism, greed, and betrayal, proving that even ashes hold the truth. Chapter 1: The Ashes of Ambition the Late. October light filtered weakly through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's sitting room in St. Mary Mead, casting delicate shadows on the polished oak table where her knitting lay in a tidy heap. The air carried the crisp scent of autumn leaves, and a fire crackled softly in the grate. But Miss Marple's attention was not on her needles or the scarf destined for the vicar's winter charity drive. Her sharp blue eyes, framed by spectacles that had seen many a village secret, were fixed on young Constable Harris, who stood awkwardly by the door, his helmet tucked under one arm. "It's a dreadful business, Miss Marple," Harris said, his voice low with the weight of gossip he knew she'd appreciate. "Mr. Grayson up at Willow Cottage found dead, and his whole study gone up in flames. They're saying it was an accident, but—" He trailed off, shifting his weight, clearly hoping for her reaction. Miss Marple's needles paused, though her expression remained serene, almost placid, as if she were merely discussing the weather. "An accident, you say?" she murmured, her voice soft but with an edge that made Harris straighten. "Fires are such curious things, Constable. They don't start themselves, do they? And dead men are hardly in the habit of lighting matches." Harris flushed, caught off guard by her perception. "Well, ma'am, Inspector Craddock's up there now, poking about. Says it looks like Mr. Grayson might have knocked over a lamp, but—" He hesitated, then added, "There's talk it wasn't just the fire that did him in. A bullet they found right in his chest." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, the only sign of her quickening interest. She set her knitting aside and leaned forward, her small, bird-like frame belying the mind that had unraveled more mysteries than the village's modest police force cared to admit. "A bullet," she repeated, as if savouring the word. How very singular. And this Mr. Grayson, Leonard Grayson, wasn't it? He was a writer, I believe. "Yes, ma'am," Harris nodded eagerly, glad to share what he knew. "Kept to himself, mostly. Lived alone in that cottage since his wife passed years ago. They say he was working on a book, a big one, though no one's read it. All burned up now, pages and all." Miss Marple's lips pursed, and she gazed out the window, toward the distant outline of Willow Cottage, its chimney just visible over the golden treetops. Leonard Grayson had been a figure of quiet intrigue in St. Mary Mead, a man who rarely ventured into the village, preferring the solitude of his typewriter to the chatter of the high street. She recalled seeing him once at the post office, a tall, gaunt figure with greying hair and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of unwritten words. His manuscript, rumoured to be his masterpiece, had been the talk of the village's literary circular, small but nosy group who speculated endlessly about its contents. Burned pages. She mused aloud, her fingers tapping lightly on the arm of her chair. A man's life's work reduced to ashes, and his life ended with a bullet. That's no accident, Constable. That's a story with a purpose. Harris blinked, unsure how to respond to her cryptic tone. "Well, ma'am, there's a few folk the inspector's looking at. Mr. Grayson's editor, Miss Cole, was up at the cottage often, pushing him to finish the book. Then there's his agent, Mr. Blaine, a city type, always talking big about the money that booked make. The son, Timothy, hasn't been round in years, but he showed up in town just yesterday. And Mrs. Dunn, the neighbour, she's always watching that cottage like a hawk." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already sorting these names like cards in a game of bridge. Margaret Cole, Victor Blaine, Timothy Grayson, Eliza Dunetch, a piece in a puzzle that was only beginning to take shape. She recalled Margaret's sharp voice at a village fete, discussing modern literature with an air of authority that bordered on arrogance. Victor Blaine, she'd heard, was charming but slippery, his polished manners masking a reputation for debts. Timothy, the son, was a shadow from Grayson's past, spoken of with pity by the village wives. And Eliza, done well, Miss Marple knew. Her type every village had one, a widow with too much time and too keen an eye. "Thank you, Constable," she said, rising with a sprightliness that surprised Harris. "I think I shall take a walk this afternoon. The air is so bracing, and Willow Cottage isn't far. Perhaps I'll pay my respects." Harris tipped his helmet, knowing better than to question her intentions. As he left, Miss Marple retrieved her coat and hat, her mind buzzing with possibilities. A fire, a bullet, a vanished manuscript. She had seen many tragedies in St. Mary Mead, but this one felt different, layered with motives as tangled as the ivy that clung to Willow Cottage's walls. People destroy what they fear, she thought, stepping into the crisp autumn air. And I wonder what Mr. Grayson's book made someone fear enough to kill. Chapter 2. The scene of the crime, the lane to Willow Cottage, wound through a copse of ancient oaks, their leaves a riot of amber and crimson under the pale October sun. Miss Jane Marple walked with a measured step, her sturdy shoes crunching against the gravel, her black handbag swinging lightly at her side. To an onlooker, she might have appeared a frail old lady out for a constitutional, her woolen scarf fluttering in the breeze, but her eyes were sharp as ever, scanning the hedgerows and distant rooftops with the alertness of a hawk. She had not come to Willow Cottage merely to mourn Leonard Grayson. She had come to see, to listen, and to understand. The cottage itself stood at the edge of St. Mary Mead, where the village gave way to open fields. Once a charming retreat with ivy-clad walls and a rose garden, it now looked forlorn, its windows blackened by soot, its thatched roof scorched in patches. A police constable stood guard at the gate, his young face solemn as he recognized Miss Marple. "Morning, ma'am," he said, touching his helmet. "Inspector Craddock's inside, if you're here to see him." "Thank you, Tom," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle but with a hint of authority that made the constable step aside. She had known Tom since he was a boy, pilfering apples from her garden, and he knew better than to question her presence. "I shan't be long, just paying my respects, you know." Inside, the air was thick with the acrid temps of smoke, mingling with the musty scent of damp wood and ruined paper. The narrow hallway led to Leonard Grayson's study, where Inspector Craddock stood amid a chaos of charred furniture and scattered debris. He was a tall man in his 40s, with a kind face and a mind Miss Marple respected, though she often thought he underestimated the complexities of human nature. He turned as she entered, his expression a mix of exasperation and fondness. "Miss Marple," he said, pushing back his hat, "I might have known you'd turn up." "Constable Harris has been talking, I suppose." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling behind her spectacles. Young Harris is a good boy, but he does enjoy a chat. I heard about poor Mr. Grayson, and I thought I might see the place for myself. A tragedy like this, it unsettles the village. Sighed, gesturing to the wreckage around them. It's a grim business, I'll give you that. Fire started here, in the study. Grayson was at his desk, shot through the chest. The fire brigade says it was likely a lamp knocked over, but he hesitated, his brow furrowing. The bullet complicates things. No gun found, not yet. And the manuscript he was working on, nothing. Left but ashes in the grate. Miss Marple stepped carefully into the room, her gaze sweeping over the scene with the precision of a painter studying a canvas. The study was small, its walls lined with bookshelves, now blistered by heat. Desk, a heavy oak affair, stood against one wall, its surface scorched but intact. A typewriter sat askew, its keys warped by the flames, and beside it lay a few scattered pages, their edges curled and blackened. The grate, where the manuscript had met its end, was a pile of grey cinders, with a faint glint of metal catching. Her ajar paperweight, perhaps, or something more significant. Curious, she said softly, bending to peer at the desk. A man shoots himself, yet the gun vanishes, and a fire just happens to destroy his life's work. It's rather too convenient, don't you think, Inspector? Craddock rubbed his chin, his eyes narrowing. You're thinking murder, aren't you? I'll admit, it's crossed my mind. A suicide doesn't add up, not with the gun missing. But the fire could have been an accident, started after the shot, or someone set it deliberately to cover their tracks. Miss Marple nodded, her fingers brushing the edge of the desk. And the manuscript, she said. I understand it was quite the talk of the village. The Shadowed Path, was it called? A book that might have made someone very nervous. Craddock grunted, picking up a charred fragment of paper and turning it over in his hands. That's what they say. Grayson was secretive about it, but his editor, Margaret Cole, claimed it was a masterpiece. His agent, Victor Blaine, was already counting the profit. Even the neighbour, Mrs. Dunn, had her nose in it, always poking about. And then there's the son, Timothy Estranged, but he turned up in town the day before the fire. Miss Marple lips pursed, her mind cataloguing the names. She had seen Margaret Cole at the village library, a woman with a brisk manner and a wardrobe too fine for her modest profession. Victor Blaine, she recalled from gossip at the post office, was a man of charm but questionable finances, often seen in London literary circles. Timothy Grayson was a ghost from the past, mentioned only in hushed tones by the older villagers who pitied his motherless childhood. And Eliza Dunwell, Miss Marple knew her well enough, a widow whose curtains twitched at the slightest movement. On the lane, let us look at the facts, she said, her tone mild but firm. A man is shot, his manuscript burned, and no weapon is found. The fire begins in this room, where he worked alone. Whoever did this knew what they were destroying and why. Craddock led her to the grate, where the ashes lay thick. The fire brigade says it started here, he said, pointing to the blackened hearth. Paper burns fast, and Grayson had stacks of it. But the bullet, that's the puzzle. The doctor says it was a single shot, straight to the heart, clean, precise. Not the sort of thing you'd expect from a man in a panic. Miss Marple knelt, her knees protesting slightly, and peered into the grate. Among the ashes, she spotted a glint of something metallic, not the paperweight, but smaller, perhaps a pen or a clip. She made a mental note to ask Craddock to have it examined. And the door? She asked, glancing toward the study's entrance. Was it locked? Unlocked, Craddock said. The front door, too. Anyone could have come in. Mrs. Dunn says she saw someone near the cottage that night, but she's vague on details. Keeps changing her story. Miss Marple stood, brushing her hands together. Mrs. Dunn is a woman who sees much and says more, she remarked, but vagueness can be as telling as precision. I should like to speak with her myself. Smiled wryly. I thought you might. But don't go stirring up the village just yet, Miss Marple. I've got enough on my plate without half of St. Mary Mead playing detective. She chuckled, a sound like the rustle of dry leaves. Oh, I shan't stir anything, Inspector. I merely observe. People are so very interesting, you know. They leave clues in the things they don't say. Leaving the study, Miss Marple stepped outside, where the air felt fresher, though still tinged with smoke. She walked the perimeter of the cottage, noting the garden's overgrown roses and the path that led to Eliza Dunn's house next door. A low hedge separated the properties, easily crossed by anyone with purpose. She paused by a window, its glass cracked from the heat, and imagined Grayson at his desk, typing late into the night. What had he written that was worth killing for? And who had stood to lose the most? As she made her way back to the lane, she saw Eliza Dunn herself, standing at her gate, her sharp eyes fixed on the cottage. "Good morning, Mrs. Dunn," Miss Marple called, her voice warm but probing. "Such a dreadful thing, isn't it? Poor Mr. Grayson." Eliza, a stout woman with grey curls and a penchant for floral aprons, nodded vigorously. "Dreadful, Miss Marple, just dreadful. I saw the flames, you know, from my bedroom window. Nearly called the fire brigade myself, but someone beat me to it, and to think, all his work gone." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of polite curiosity. "You saw the flames, you say, and nothing else, no one coming or going?" Eliza's cheeks flushed, and she fidgeted with her apron. "Well, I might have seen a shadow, perhaps. Hard to say in the dark. Could have been a man, or maybe not. I don't like to speculate." "Of course not," Miss Marple said, her smile unwavering. "But you've always had such a keen eye, Mrs. Dunn. I'm sure you'd notice anything out of the ordinary." Eliza muttered something about chores and hurried back to her house, leaving Miss Marple to ponder her words. A shadow, indeed. Eliza's hesitance suggested she knew more than she was letting on. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that pressing too hard yielded little. People revealed themselves in time, especially when they thought no one was watching. As she walked back to St. Mary Mead, the village clock chiming noon, Miss Marple's mind turned to the suspects Craddock had mentioned. Margaret Cole, the editor, had been pushing Grayson to publish, her ambition clear in her every gesture. Victor Blaine, the agent, had a reputation for living beyond his means, and a book like Grayson's could have been his salvation or his ruin. Timothy, the son, carried the weight of a broken family, his motives clouded by years of estrangement. And Eliza Dunn, with her watchful eyes and shifting stories, might be more than a mere bystander. Miss Marple paused at the village green, where children played among the fallen leaves. She thought of a case years ago when a stolen necklace had been found in a gardener's shed, not because the gardener was guilty, but because someone had needed a convenient hiding place. "It's always about what's hidden," she murmured, her scarf fluttering in the breeze. A gun, a manuscript, a motive, all hidden in plain sight. She resolved to visit Margaret Cole at the earliest opportunity, perhaps over a cup of tea at the village shop. Editors, she knew, were privy to secrets writers dared not share with others. And if the shadowed path was as explosive as rumoured, Margaret might hold the key to its destruction and Grayson's death. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the green. Miss Marple adjusted her hat and continued her walk, her mind as busy as the village around her. A murder, a fire, a missing gun. St. Mary Mead had seen its share of mysteries. But this one, she sensed, would unravel only when she understood. The heart of the manuscript itself. Books, she thought, are dangerous things. They hold truths some would kill to keep silent. Chapter 3. The editor's ambition. The village tea shop, with its gingham curtains and the faint clink of china, was a hub of St. Mary Mead's social life, where secrets were traded as freely as scones. Miss Jane Marple settled into a corner table, her black handbag resting primly on her lap, her eyes bright with purpose behind her spectacles. She had arranged to meet Margaret Cole, Leonard Grayson's editor, under the guise of discussing the village book club's next selection. The invitation had been accepted with a brisk politeness that Miss Marple found telling Margaret was not one to linger over pleasantries. At precisely 3 o'clock, Margaret swept into the tea shop, her tailored coat and sleek leather gloves, a touch too sophisticated for the rustic setting. She was a woman in her mid-40s, with auburn hair swept into a neat chignon and a face that bore the sharp lines of ambition. Her smile, as she greeted Miss Marple, was professional but guarded, like a shopkeeper sizing up a customer. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to invite me," Margaret said, sliding into the chair opposite. "I'm afraid I'm not much for book clubs, but I'm happy to chat. Such a dreadful thing about poor Leonard." "Quite dreadful," Miss Marple agreed, pouring tea from a floral pot with a steadiness that belied her racing thoughts. "I understand you were his editor. It must be a great loss, not only personally but professionally. His manuscript, here, was something extraordinary." Margaret's hand paused on her teacup, her manicured nails catching the light. "Oh yes, the shadowed path was remarkable. Leonard had a rare gift, though he was maddeningly slow. He'd rewrite a single page a dozen times, always chasing perfection." Her voice carried a hint of exasperation, quickly masked by a sip of tea. Miss Marple's needles, tucked into her bag, might have clicked in rhythm with her thoughts had she been knitting. Instead, she tilted her head, her expression one of gentle curiosity. "Perfection is a heavy burden," she said. "I suppose you must have been eager to see the book published. Such a triumph for you both." Margaret's lips tightened, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "Naturally, I wanted it published. Leonard was sitting on a fortune, but he couldn't see it. He kept delaying, fussing over details no reader would notice. I told him it was ready, but he wouldn't listen." Miss Marple noted the edge in Margaret's tone, the way her fingers drummed lightly on the table. She recalled a young woman in St. Mary Mead years ago, a governess who had pushed too hard for her employer's favour and lost everything when her impatience turned to theft. "Ambition can be a restless thing," Miss Marple said softly, as if to herself. "It makes one wonder what might drive someone to act hastily." Margaret's eyes narrowed, but she recovered quickly, offering a thin smile. "Publishing is a hasty business, Miss Marple. Deadlines, contracts, advances, it's all about timing." Leonard didn't understand that. He thought he had all the time in the world, and now he has none, Miss Marple said, her voice so gentle it might have been a condolence. She reached for a scone, crumbling it delicately between her fingers. "Tell me, Miss Cole. Did you see the manuscript recently? Before the fire, I mean. It must have been a blow to lose such a work. Margaret hesitated, her gaze drifting to the window where the high street bustled with late afternoon shoppers. I saw a draft a month ago, she said at last. It was brilliant, but unfinished. Leonard was paranoid, kept it locked in his desk. He wouldn't even let me take a copy, said he didn't trust anyone, not even me. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, a gesture so subtle it might have gone unnoticed. Not even you, how curious. I'd have thought an editor would be his closest confidant. Margaret shrugged, but the movement was stiff, as if her shoulders carried an unseen weight. Writers are peculiar. Leonard was more so than most. He thought everyone was out to steal his ideas, publishers, other writers, even his own agent. Mr. Blaine, you mean? Miss Marple asked, her tone as innocent as a child's. I've heard he's quite the charming man, very persuasive. Margaret's laugh was sharp, like glass breaking. Victor, oh, he's persuasive, all right. Always talking up Leonard's book as if it were the next bestseller, but I doubt he'd read more than a page. He's all about the deal, not the art. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over Margaret's words like cards in a well-played hand. The editor's disdain for Victor Blaine was palpable, yet there was something else, a guardedness, that suggested she knew more than she was saying. Miss Marple thought of a village dressmaker who had once hidden a stolen brooch in a seam, thinking no one would look there. Secrets, she knew, were often stitched into casual remarks. And what was the book about, if I may ask? Miss Marple said, leaning forward slightly. I know so little of such things, but I'm told it was quite revealing. Margaret's cup clinked against its saucer, a sound that seemed louder. In the quiet tea shop, it was a novel, she said carefully, but rooted in truth. Leonard had a way of weaving real people into his stories, literary folk, you know, thinly disguised. It made the book dangerous, in a way. Brilliant, but dangerous. Dangerous, Miss Marple repeated, her voice a murmur. Enough to make someone want to destroy it? Margaret's eyes met hers, and for a moment the air between them seemed to tighten. I suppose, she said, if someone had something to hide, but that's speculation, Miss Marple. I deal in manuscripts, not motives. Of course, Miss Marple said, smiling as if the matter were settled. She changed the subject to the book club, chatting about Jane Austen and Dickens until Margaret relaxed, her guard slipping like a loosened knot. But Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, piecing together the fragments of their conversation. Margaret's ambition was clear. She had staked her reputation on Grayson's book, perhaps her future. A delayed publication might have frustrated her, but a destroyed manuscript, that was a loss she could ill afford. As they parted, Margaret promising to consider the book club, Miss Marple stepped into the fading light of the high street. She noticed Margaret's brooch, a gold piece shaped like a quill, gleaming against her coat. It was an expensive trinket, out of place for an editor on a modest salary. Ambition, Miss Marple thought, can be costly, and cost can drive people to desperate acts. She made her way home, the village settling into its evening quiet. At her cottage, she lit the fire and sat by the window, her knitting untouched. Margaret Cole had revealed more than she intended, not in her words, but in her pauses, her glances, her too quick dismissal of Victor Blaine. Miss Marple recalled a case in St. Mary Mead years ago, when a young clerk's ambition had led him to forge a cheque, thinking it would secure his future. He had been caught, not by his crime, but by the pride he took in his new watch. Bought with stolen money. Margaret Cole wants something, Miss Marple murmured, gazing at the flickering flames. But is it fame or is it safety? She resolved. To learn more about the shadowed path, its secrets, its truths, and the people it threatened. Tomorrow she would seek out Victor Blaine, whose charm, she suspected, hid a tangle of motives as intricate as her own knitting. The village clock struck 6, its chimes drifting through the dusk. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind already weaving the threads of the mystery. People are so very predictable, she thought. They hide their fears in plain sight, if only one knows where to look. Chapter 4. The Agent's Secret. The Red Lion in a squat timbered building at the heart of St. Mary Mead hummed with the quiet bustle of early evening. Its low ceilings and polished oak bar lent an air of cozy intimacy, but Miss Jane Marple, seated in a corner by the inglenook fireplace, was not here for the ambience. She had learned from the village grapevine that Victor Blaine, Leonard Grayson's literary agent, was staying at the inn, having arrived from London just before the tragedy at Willow Cottage. A chance encounter, she decided, would be the best. Approach nothing too formal, just a chat to put the man at ease. She sipped her sherry, her eyes bright behind her spectacles, and waited. Victor entered the lounge shortly after 7, his tailored overcoat slightly rumpled as if he had travelled in haste. He was a man in his early 50s, with a lean face, slicked back hair, and a smile that seemed to promise more than it delivered. His charm was evident in the way he nodded to the barmaid, who blushed as she poured his whiskey. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted the slight tremor in his hand as he took the glass, a nervous tick, perhaps, or the weight of something heavier. "Good evening, Mr. Blaine," she called, her voice carrying the gentle warmth of a kindly aunt. "Might I trouble you for a moment? I'm Jane Marple, a friend of the vicar's. I understand you knew poor Mr. Grayson." Victor turned, his smile quick but wary, like a fox catching a scent. "Miss Marple," he said, crossing the room with an easy stride. "A pleasure, yes. I was Leonard's agent. Terrible business. What happened? Care to join me for a drink?" "Oh, I'm quite content with my sherry," she replied, gesturing to the chair opposite. "But do sit. I've been hearing so much about Mr. Grayson's book. It must be a great loss to you, professionally speaking." Victor settled into the chair, his posture relaxed but his eyes darting to the door, as if expecting an interruption. "A loss, yes," he said, swirling his whiskey. Leonard's book was going to be big, huge. Even I had publishers lined up, ready to bid. But he kept stalling, rewriting, fussing over every word. Drove me half mad, if I'm honest. Miss Marple's lips curved into a sympathetic smile, though her mind was as sharp as the knitting needles tucked in her bag. It must be trying, working with such a perfectionist. "I suppose you spent a good deal of time at Willow Cottage, coaxing him along." Victor's laugh was short, almost a bark. "Coaxing, cajoling, begging, you name it. I was up there a week ago, trying to get him to send me the latest draft. He wouldn't budge. Said he didn't trust the post, didn't trust anyone, really. Kept it all locked in his desk like it was the crown jewels. How very cautious," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "And you were in London, I hear, when the fire happened. Such a long way to come at short notice." Victor's fingers tightened on his glass, though his smile held. "Yes, I was in town, meeting a client. Caught the late train back when I heard the news. Dreadful shock." He reached into his pocket, producing a crumpled train ticket, which He slid across the table as if to prove his point. There's the stub, if you're curious. Miss Marple glanced at it, a return ticket from London, dated the night of the fire, but smudged and creased, as if it had been handled too often. How thoughtful of you to keep it, she said, her voice so gentle it might have been a compliment. Travel can be so unpredictable. I once knew a young man in St. Mary Mead who missed his train and ended up in quite a tangle of alibis. You know, can be such slippery things. Victor's smile faltered, and he took a quick sip of whiskey. Well, I was where I said I was, he said, a touch too firmly. Leonard trusted me, you know. I was his lifeline to the publishing world. He'd have been lost without me. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the fire, where logs crackled softly. She thought of a village shopkeeper who had once boasted of his honesty while pocketing extra change, his confidence a mask for his guilt. Victor's charm, she sensed, was much the same, a polished surface over something less certain. You must have known his work well, she said. The Shadowed Path, such an intriguing title. Did it live up to its promise? Victor leaned back, his expression warming as if on safer ground. Oh, it was brilliant. A real exposé, you might say. Leonard had a knack for digging into people's secrets, weaving them into his characters. Publishers were salivating, but he wouldn't. Let it go until it was perfect. Cost me a fortune in delayed deals. Secrets, Miss Marple repeated, her voice soft as a whisper. How fascinating. I suppose such a book might make some people uneasy. Victor's eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw a flicker of something, fear, perhaps, or calculation. Uneasy, he said, forcing a chuckle. Maybe, but it's just fiction, Miss Marple. No one takes it seriously. She smiled, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Oh, but people do take stories seriously, Mr. Blaine, especially when they hit too close to home. I remember a young lady in our village who wrote a play for the church, Fate Nothing Grand, but it caused such a stir because everyone thought they recognized themselves in it. Words can be dangerous, don't you think? Victor shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming on the table. Leonard's book was fiction, he said again, as if convincing himself. But yes, he had a way of making things feel real. Too real, maybe. Miss Marple sipped her sherry, letting the silence stretch. She noted the sheen of sweat on Victor's brow, the way his gaze kept returning to the door. He was nervous, she decided, and not just about the loss of a client. She thought of a case. Years ago, when a local solicitor had been caught embezzling funds, his guilt betrayed not by his actions, but by the way he avoided meeting anyone's eyes. Victor, she suspected, was hiding something similar, a secret tied to the manuscript, perhaps, or to the man who wrote it. Tell me, Mr. Blaine, she said, her tone as light as if she were discussing the weather, did you ever read the full manuscript? I imagine it must have been quite a privilege. Victor hesitated, his fingers pausing on his glass. Parts of it, he admitted. Leonard sent me snippets, but he was cagey. Said he'd show me the whole thing when it was done. I didn't push well, not too hard. He laughed, but it was a hollow sound, like a bell with a crack. Miss Marple's mind turned to the ashes in Grayson's grate, the bullet in his chest, the missing gun. Victor's alibi, flimsy as that train ticket, suggested he was in St. Mary. Mead the night of the fire, or close enough to matter. And his insistence on the book's brilliance, coupled with his unease, hinted at a deeper stake in its fate. She recalled Margaret Cole's disdain for Victor, her suggestion that he cared more for profit than art, Was Victor's charm a shield for greed, or something more desperate? As the barmaid cleared their glasses, Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "You've been most kind, Mr. Blaine," she said. "I shan't keep you. I'm sure you have much to attend to with such a loss." Victor stood, his smile returning but not reaching his eyes. "Always a pleasure, Miss Marple. If you hear anything about the book club, let me know. I might need a distraction." She nodded, her expression serene, but as she left the Red Lion, her thoughts were anything but calm. Victor Blaine was a man on edge, his polished exterior cracking under the weight of something unspoken. She thought of the village grocer who had once sold tainted meat, swearing it was fresh while his hands shook behind the counter. Victor's nerves, she suspected, were tied to more than a lost deal. Walking home through the quiet streets, Miss Marple passed the church, its spire a dark silhouette against the twilight. She considered the manuscript, The Shadowed Path, a book that had stirred ambition, fear, and perhaps murder. Victor had seen parts of it, enough to know its value or its danger. Had he read something that made him act? Or was he, like Margaret, a victim of Grayson's secrecy, caught in a web he didn't fully understand? At her cottage, Miss Marple lit a lamp and settled by the fire, her knitting untouched. She thought of the suspects, Margaret's ambition, Victor's nerves, Timothy's estrangement, Eliza's watchful eyes. Each had a reason to fear Grayson's book, but only one had pulled the trigger and set the fire. "Secrets," she murmured, gazing at the flames. "They burn brighter than any manuscript, and they leave scars no fire can hide." Tomorrow she would seek out Timothy Grayson, the prodigal son whose absence from his father's life was as telling as his sudden return. For now, she let the fire's warmth seep into her bones, her mind weaving the threads of the mystery into a pattern only she could see. Chapter 5. The prodigal son. The morning mist clung to the fields of St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of the hedgerows as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the village post office, a basket of freshly baked scones tucked under her arm. Her destination was not the post office itself, but the small flat above it, where Timothy Grayson, Leonard Grayson's estranged son, was said to be staying. The village buzzed with whispers about Timothy's return, a young man who had left St. Mary Mead years ago under a cloud of resentment, only to reappear on the eve of his father's death. Miss Marple, with her knack for turning chance encounters into revelations, had sent a note inviting him for tea, ostensibly to offer condolences. Her real purpose, of course, was to observe. The flat was reached by a narrow staircase, its walls papered in faded roses. Timothy opened the door at her knock, his face pale and unshaven, his eyes shadowed with something that might have been grief or sleeplessness. He was in his late 20s, with his father's gaunt features, but none of his intensity, his shoulders hunched as if carrying a weight he could not name. His jacket, patched at the elbows, spoke of a life less prosperous than his father's, and Miss Marple noted the faint smell of tobacco clinging to him, a habit she recalled Leonard Grayson had despised. "Miss Marple," Timothy said, his voice low and guarded, "kind of you to come. I don't get many visitors." He stepped aside, gesturing to a small sitting room cluttered with books and unwashed dishes. "Oh, my dear boy, it's no trouble at all," Miss Marple said, her tone as warm as the scones she set on the table. "I thought you might like a bit of company after such a dreadful loss. Your father was much admired in the village, you know." Timothy's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Was he? I wouldn't know. We didn't talk much these last few years." He busied himself with a kettle, avoiding her gaze, his movements jerky, as if he resented the intrusion. Miss Marple settled into a worn armchair, her hands folded neatly. In her lap, her eyes taking in every detail, the cracked teacup on the sideboard, the dogged novel by the window, the absence of any photograph of Leonard Grayson. "It must be hard," she said gently, "to lose a father, even one you weren't close to. I understand you hadn't seen him in some time." Timothy poured tea with a clatter, his hands unsteady. 10 years, he said curtly. "Not since I was 18. He sent me off to boarding school after Mother died, and that was that. All he cared about was his writing, his precious book." The bitterness in his voice was sharp, like a knife slipped into a polite conversation. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression one of mild sympathy, though her mind was cataloguing his words with the precision of a librarian. She thought of a young man in St. Mary Mead who had once run away from home, nursing a grudge against his father's neglect, only to return when a will was read. Resentment, she knew, could fester into something darker. His book, she said, as if the thought had just occurred to her. The Shadowed Path, wasn't it? I've heard it was quite remarkable. Did you ever read it? Timothy's hand froze on his cup, his knuckles whitening. Me, no. He didn't share it with anyone, least of all me. I didn't even know what it was about until the village started talking. Some big expose, they say. Not that it matters, now it's gone. Miss Marple tilted her head, her spectacles catching the light. Gone, yes, but not forgotten. It's curious, isn't it, how a book can cause such a stir, even in ashes. I suppose it might have made someone uneasy, someone who knew its secrets. Timothy's eyes flicked to hers, then away, settling on the window where the mist pressed against the glass. I wouldn't know, he muttered. I didn't come back for his book. I came because... He trailed off, his jaw tightening. Because you heard he was ill. Miss Marple prompted, her voice soft as a whisper. Or, perhaps you had business in the village. He shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm on the table. Something like that. I got a letter from his neighbour, Mrs. Dunn. Said he wasn't himself, that he was acting strange. I thought maybe it was time to, I don't know, make peace. Too late now. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, a gesture so subtle it might have been missed. Eliza Dunn, she noted, had a habit of inserting herself into others' affairs, her letters as pointed as her gossip. How kind of Mrs. Dunn to write, she said. She's very observant, isn't she? Always watching. Willow Cottage, I hear. Timothy snorted, a sound halfway between derision and exhaustion. Observant, nosy, more like. She was always poking around, asking father about his work. He hated it, said she was worse than a vulture. Miss Marple smiled, crumbling a scone between her fingers. Some people do take an interest in their neighbours. But tell me, Timothy, when did you arrive in St. Mary Mead? It must have been a shock to find your father gone so soon after. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table. The day before, he said at last, I was staying here, sorting out what to say to him. I went to the cottage that evening, but I didn't go in. Couldn't bring myself to knock. Next thing I know, it's all over the village fire. Bullet, the lot. Miss Marple's mind turned over his words, her thoughts as precise as the stitches in her knitting. Timothy's arrival the day before the fire was convenient, too convenient, perhaps. She recalled a case in the village years ago when a young man had returned home claiming reconciliation only to be caught pilfering his mother's savings. Timothy's story had the same ring of half-truth. His reluctance to meet his father's eyes, suggesting more than filial regret. "And you didn't see anyone else that night?" she asked, her tone as casual as if she were discussing the weather. "No one near the cottage, perhaps?" Timothy shook his head, but his hands trembled slightly, betraying a nervousness he could not hide. "No one," he said. "It was dark, misty. I didn't stay long, just stood outside for a bit, then came back here." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle understanding, though her mind was racing. Timothy's trembling hands, his vague account of the evening, his sudden return after years of absence, pointed to a man with something to conceal. She thought of the missing gun, the ashes in the grate, the manuscript that had vanished in flames. Had Timothy known its contents? Had he come to confront his father, only to find himself entangled in something far worse? She rose, smoothing her skirt with a practiced gesture. "You've been most kind to indulge an old lady's curiosity," she said. "I shan't keep you longer. These scones are for you, my own recipe. A little comfort in difficult times." Timothy managed a weak smile, standing to see her out. "Thanks, Miss Marple. I appreciate it." As she descended the narrow staircase, Miss Marple's thoughts were already weaving a new thread into the tapestry of the mystery. Timothy's bitterness toward his father was palpable, his return timed with unsettling precision. She recalled Margaret Cole's ambition, Victor Blaine's nerves, and now Timothy's resentment. Each a knot in the same tangled skein. But it was Eliza Dunn's letter that intrigued her most, a letter that had drawn Timothy back to St. Mary Mead, perhaps setting the stage for murder. Outside, the mist had lifted, revealing the village in sharp relief. Miss Marple paused by the post office, her eyes drifting to Willow Cottage in the distance. She thought of a village girl who had once burned a letter to hide her shame, only to leave a telltale ash in the hearth. Timothy, she suspected, was hiding something similar, a motive, perhaps, born of years of neglect and a book that threatened to expose more than its author intended. She resolved to visit Eliza Dunn next, to probe the widow's watchful ways and uncover what her letter to Timothy had truly meant. For now, she walked home, her basket lighter but her mind heavy with possibilities. "Resentment," she murmured, her scarf fluttering in the breeze, "is a slow poison, but it can kill as surely as a bullet." Chapter 6. The neighbours' watchful eyes. The lane to Eliza Dunn's cottage was lined with late-blooming asters, their purple heads nodding in the cool morning breeze. Miss Jane Marple walked with her usual measured step, a jar of her homemade damson jam tucked in her basket as a pretext for her visit. Eliza, the widow who lived next to Willow Cottage, was known in St. Mary Mead for her sharp tongue and sharper eyes, her curtains twitching at every passing shadow. Miss Marple, with her knack for coaxing truths from the reluctant, knew that Eliza's gossip might hold the key to Leonard Grayson's death, the burning of his manuscript. Eliza's cottage was a tidy affair, its whitewashed walls gleaming under a slate roof, its garden a model of order, save for a patch of overgrown nettles near the shed. Miss Marple knocked, her knuckles light but firm, and was greeted by Eliza herself, a stout woman in her 60s with grey curls pinned tightly and an apron that smelled faintly of lavender and bleach. Her eyes, small and bright as a bird's, widened at the sight of her visitor. "Miss Marple," Eliza exclaimed, her voice a mix of surprise and suspicion. "What brings you here? Not that I'm not pleased, mind, but it's a rare day I get callers." "Oh, Mrs. Dunn, I was passing and thought you might like some of my jam, Miss Marple said, her smile as warm as a summer afternoon. And of course, I wanted to offer my sympathies about poor Mr. Grayson. Living so close, it must have been a terrible shock. Eliza's face softened, though her eyes remained wary. Terrible? Yes. Come in, come in. I'll put the kettle on. She ushered Miss Marple into a parlour so pristine it seemed no one ever sat in it, the furniture polished to a mirror shine, the cushions plumped to perfection. A small table held a vase of chrysanthemums, their scent mingling with the faint tang of smoke that still lingered in the air from Willow Cottage. As Eliza bustled with the tea tray, Miss Marple's gaze wandered to the window, which offered a clear view of Grayson's garden and the charred remains of his study. "Such a fine view you have," she remarked, her tone innocent. "You must see everything that happens at Willow Cottage." Eliza set the tray down with a clatter, her cheeks flushing. "Well, I don't pry, if that's what you mean," she said, a touch too quickly. "But you can't help noticing things. Living so close, poor Mr. Grayson, always at his typewriter, day and night. And then that awful fire lit up the whole lane. It did." Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea, her fingers delicate on the china. "It must have been frightening," she said. "I hear you saw something that night, a figure, perhaps. The village is full of talk, you know." Eliza's lips pursed, and she busied herself with the sugar bowl, avoiding Miss Marple's gaze. "People do talk, don't they? I told the inspector what I saw, or thought I saw. It was dark, misty, hard to be sure. Might have been a man, might have been nothing at all. I'm not one to make a fuss." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, her expression one of gentle curiosity. "Of course not," she said. "But you've always had such a keen eye. Mrs. Dunn, I remember when Mrs. Price lost her brooch, and you were the one who spotted it in the churchyard. A figure near the cottage. Surely you'd notice if it was someone familiar." Eliza fidgeted, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. "Well, I couldn't say for certain. It was just a shadow, moving quick-like toward the lane. Could have been anyone, Mr. Blaine, maybe, or young Timothy. Even Miss Cole was always coming and going, pestering Mr. Grayson about his book." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind cataloguing Eliza's words with the precision of a seamstress. Threading a needle, the widow's story was vague, yet she had named all three suspects, Margaret Cole, Victor Blaine, and Timothy Grayson, as if casting a net to see what it might catch. Miss Marple thought of a village spinster who had once spread rumours to deflect attention from her own petty thefts. Eliza's shifting tale, she suspected, hid more than indecision. And Mr. Grayson's book, Miss Marple said, as if the thought had just occurred to her. "I hear it was quite the talk of the village. Did he ever speak of it to you? Living so close, you must have had many a chat over the hedge." Eliza's eyes narrowed, and she set her cup down with a sharp clink. "He wasn't one for chatting," she said. "Kept to himself, mostly. But I heard things everyone did. That book, The Shadowed Path, was supposed to be full of secrets, people's private business dressed up as fiction. He was cagey about it, locked it away like it was gold." Miss Marple nodded, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Secrets can be troublesome," she said softly. "I suppose a book like that might make someone nervous, someone who didn't want their story told." Eliza's flush deepened, and she rose to adjust the curtains, her movements brisk. "I wouldn't know about that," she said. "I mind my own business, but Mr. Grayson wasn't himself, lately snapping at me when I asked after his health, acting like he was being watched. I wrote to his son, you know, told him his father needed looking after. Miss Marple's spectacles glinted as she tilted her head. How thoughtful of you, she said. And Timothy came at once, I hear. It's a pity he arrived too late to make peace. Eliza's hands stilled on the curtains, and for a moment she stood frozen, her back to the room. Yes, a pity, she said at last, her voice tight. I thought it was the right thing to do. Family ought to stick together. Miss Marple's mind turned over this new piece of the puzzle. Eliza's letter to Timothy had drawn him back to St. Mary Mead, a catalyst for his presence on the night of the fire. Was it kindness, as she claimed, or something more calculated? She recalled a case in the village years ago, when a busybody had sent an anonymous note to stir up trouble, hoping to profit from the chaos. Eliza's watchful ways, she suspected, might conceal a similar intent. Tell me, Mrs. Dunn, Miss Marple said, her tone as light as a summer breeze, did you ever see anything unusual at the cottage? Visitors, perhaps, or anything out of place? I'm sure you'd notice, with your gift for observation. Eliza turned, her face a mask of indignation. I'm not a snoop, Miss Marple, if that's what you're implying. But yes, I saw Miss Cole there often, always with her notebooks, pushing Mr. Grayson to finish. And Mr. Blaine, with his fancy car, coming and going like he owned the place. Even Timothy was there the night before, just standing outside, looking lost. I didn't think much of it then, but now. Her voice trailed off, and Miss Marple noted the way her eyes darted to the window, as if expecting to see that shadow again. Eliza's story was a tapestry of half-truths, each thread carefully chosen to deflect scrutiny. She had seen Timothy, yet claimed uncertainty about the figure in the mist. She had written to him, yet played the innocent neighbor. Miss Marple thought of the missing gun, the ashes in the grate, and wondered if Eliza's keen eyes had caught more than she was willing to admit. Rising, Miss Marple smoothed her skirt and picked up her basket. You've been most kind, Mrs. Dunn, she said. This jam should go nicely with your scones. And do let me know if you remember anything else about that night. Even the smallest detail can be so illuminating. Eliza nodded, her smile tight, and saw her to the door. As Miss Marple stepped into the lane, she glanced back at the cottage, noting the shed where the nettles grew wild. Something about it tugged at her memory, a glint, perhaps, or the sense of something hidden. She made a mental note to mention it to Inspector Craddock, though she would frame it as a passing thought, not a suspicion. The village was waking now, shopkeepers sweeping their steps, children darting toward the school. Miss Marple walked slowly, her mind weaving the threads of her conversation with Eliza into the larger pattern of the mystery. Margaret Cole's ambition, Victor Blaine's nerves, Timothy Grayson's resentment, and now Eliza Dunn's evasion was a piece of the puzzle, but the picture remained incomplete. The manuscript, the shadowed path, was the key. Its secrets dangerous enough to warrant murder and arson. She thought of a village scandal years ago, when a nosy housekeeper had overheard a conversation and used it to blackmail her employer, only to be caught when her own letters betrayed her. Eliza, she suspected, was playing a similar game, her letter to Timothy a move in a larger scheme. But was she a bystander, a meddler, or something more? At her cottage, Miss Marple set her basket down and lit the fire, the flames casting shadows. On the walls, she sat by the window, her knitting untouched, her mind as busy as the village outside. Eyes that see too much, she murmured, often hide what they know. And what Mrs. Dunn knows may be the spark that lit this fire. Tomorrow she would return to her notes, piecing together the motives and movements of the suspects. For now she let the fire's warmth settle her thoughts, knowing that the truth, like a stubborn knot, would unravel with patience. Chapter 7. A pattern emerges. The late afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the polished floorboards. Outside, St. Mary Mead settled into its usual rhythm, the distant laughter of children mingling with the clatter of a milk cart on the high street. Inside, however, Miss Marple's sitting room was a hive of quiet industry. Her knitting lay abandoned on the arm of her chair, replaced by a small notebook where she had jotted down her observations about Leonard Grayson's murder. The fire crackled softly in the grate, but her attention was fixed on the pages before her. Each name and detail a thread in the tapestry of the mystery. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her sharp blue eyes scanning the notes with the precision of a watchmaker. Margaret Cole, with her polished ambition and expensive brooch, had been eager to see Grayson's manuscript published, perhaps too eager. Victor Blaine, the charming agent, hid his financial troubles behind a slick smile and a flimsy alibi. Timothy Grayson, the estranged son, carried a decade's worth of resentment. His sudden return to St. Mary Mead timed with unsettling precision. And Eliza Dunn, the watchful neighbour, wove vague tales of shadows and letters, her nosiness masking something deeper. Each suspect, Miss Marple mused, had a reason to fear the shadowed path, but only one had pulled the trigger and set the fire. She set her teacup down, her fingers tapping lightly on the notebook. "A bullet and a blaze," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the fire's crackle. "A manuscript destroyed, a gun vanished. It's not just a crime, it's a performance, staged to hide something specific." She thought of a village scandal years ago, when a stolen letter had been burned to conceal a betrayal, only to leave a telltale ash that pointed to the culprit. It's always about what's missing, she decided, her mind circling back to the absent gun. Rising, she crossed to the window, gazing out at the village green where dusk was settling like a soft veil. The missing gun troubled her most. Inspector Craddock had confirmed no weapon was found at Willow Cottage, yet a bullet had ended Grayson's life. A suicide without a gun was no suicide at all, and a murderer who took the weapon suggested calculation, not panic. She recalled her visit to the cottage, the charred study, the glint of metal in the gratter paperweight, perhaps, or something else. She made a mental note to ask Craddock if his men had examined it closely. Her thoughts turned to the manuscript itself. The Shadowed Path, by all accounts, was more than a novel. It was a mirror held up to the literary world, reflecting truths that someone had wanted silenced. Margaret had called it revolutionary. Victor had seen it as a goldmine, Timothy claimed. Ignorance, and Eliza hinted at its secrets. Miss Marple's lips pursed as she considered the pattern. A book that dangerous, she thought, would threaten someone with something to lose: reputation, money, or perhaps their freedom. She returned to her chair, picking up her pen to add a new note. Motive tied to manuscripts, content. She underlined it twice, her mind drifting to a case in St. Mary Mead years ago, when a local poet had written a verse mocking the village council, only to find his papers slashed to ribbons. The culprit, a pompous alderman, had feared exposure. Was Grayson's book a similar threat, its pages holding a truth that drove someone to murder? The suspects, she realized, formed a constellation of motives, each orbiting the manuscript. Margaret Cole's ambition suggested she might have acted to secure her place in the literary world, or to protect a secret the book revealed. Victor. Blaine's debts pointed to desperation. Had he burned the manuscript to hide a financial scandal, or to eliminate a rival's claim to its profits? Timothy's resentment, festering over years of neglect, might have boiled over into violence, especially if the book mocked his family's past. And Eliza Dunn, with her letter to Timothy and her shifting stories, might have played a more active role than mere observer. Miss Marple leaned back, her eyes narrowing as she considered Eliza's involvement. The widow's letter had brought Timothy back to St. Mary Mead, a move that seemed altruistic but could have been calculated. She recalled a village busybody who had once orchestrated a quarrel to distract from her own misdeeds. Was Eliza's nosiness a cover for something more sinister? And what of the glint in her shed, half hidden among the nettles? It was a detail that nagged at her, like a dropped stitch in a pattern. She rose again, crossing to her writing desk, where she kept a small map of the village, sketched years ago for a church fete. She traced the path from Willow Cottage to Eliza's house, noting the low hedge that separated them. Close enough to see everything, she murmured, close enough to act. The fire, Craddock had said, started in the study's grate, where the manuscript had been reduced to ashes. A deliberate act, she decided, not a lamp knocked over in a struggle. Whoever set it knew what they were destroying. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was young Betty, the vicar's niece, come to collect the scarf Miss Marple had promised for the charity drive. "Oh, Miss Marple, you're always so busy," Betty said, eyeing the notebook curiously. "Are you solving another mystery, Miss Marple smiled, tucking the notebook into a drawer. "Just keeping my mind active, my dear," she said. "An old lady must have her hobbies." She handed Betty the scarf, her fingers lingering on the soft wool. "Tell me, Betty, have you heard any talk about Mr. Grayson's book? The young people always know more than they let on." Betty blushed, her eyes bright with gossip. "Only what's going round the village. They say it was full of secrets about important people, writers and such. My friend Sally, who works at the tea shop, heard Miss Cole say it would have caused a scandal if it got out." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted, though her expression remained serene. "A scandal," she repeated. "How very interesting. Thank you, Betty. Mind you don't catch cold on your way back." As Betty left, Miss Marple returned to her chair, her mind buzzing with this new tidbit. A scandal, indeed. The Shadowed Path was no ordinary novel. It was a weapon, its pages sharp enough to cut reputations to ribbons. She thought of Margaret's unease when questioned about the book's content, Victor's nervous laughter, Timothy's trembling hands, and Eliza's vague tales. Each had a stake in the manuscript's fate, but who had the most to lose? She picked up her pen again, adding another note. Scandal in literary circles. Who was exposed? She underlined it, her mind turning to the next step. She needed to know more about the manuscript itself, its themes, its targets, its truths. Inspector Craddock had mentioned fragments found in the ashes. Perhaps they held a clue. She resolved to ask him to share any recovered pages, framing it as a favour to an old lady's curiosity. The village clock struck 5, its chimes drifting through the dusk. Miss Marple rose to draw the curtains, her gaze lingering on the quiet street outside. She thought of a case years ago when a stolen diary had been burned to hide a love affair, only for a single page to survive, tucked inside a book. Something always survives, she murmured. Even ashes tell a story. She decided to attend the village fete tomorrow, where the suspects would likely gather. People, she knew, revealed themselves in crowds, their guards lowered by the chatter and bustle. Margaret, Victor, Timothy, and Eliza would be there, and Miss Marple would watch them closely, noting their glances, their silences, their lies. For now, she lit a lamp and settled by the fire, her mind as sharp as the needles she had set aside. A pattern is emerging, she thought, and every pattern has a flaw. I shall find it in time. Chapter 8. The ghost of the manuscript of Village Fate was in full swing on the green of St. Mary Mead, with stalls draped in bunting and the air thick with the scents of fresh-baked pies and mulled cider. Children darted between the games, their laughter mingling with the strum of a local fiddler, while the adults of the village exchanged pleasantries and gossip under a sky dappled with autumn clouds. Miss Jane Marple, dressed in her best tweed coat and a hat adorned with a single feather, moved through the crowd with the unobtrusive grace of a sparrow, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. She had come not for the apple bobbing or the tambola, but to observe the four figures at the heart of Leonard Grayson's murder: Margaret Cole, Victor Blaine, Timothy Grayson, and Eliza Dunn. The fate, she knew, would loosen tongues and reveal truths that quiet parlours often concealed. Miss Marple paused by the cake stall, where Mrs. Bantry, her old friend, was presiding over a display of Victoria's sponges. "Jane, you're looking positively purposeful," Mrs. Bantry said, her eyes twinkling. "Don't tell me you're sniffing out another mystery." Miss Marple smiled, her fingers adjusting the brim of her hat. "Oh, Dolly, I'm just here for the fate, though I must say, the village is still talking about poor Mr. Grayson. His book, I hear, was quite the sensation." Mrs. Bantry leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Sensation's the word. My maid heard from the butcher's boy that it was full of scandal literary folk, publishers, all sorts of secrets. No wonder someone burned it. Imagine the fuss if it had been published." Miss Marple's lips pursed, her mind filing away this confirmation of the manuscript's dangerous content. The shadowed path, it seemed, was a ghost that haunted St. Mary Mead, its absence as potent as its presence. She thanked Mrs. Bantry and moved on, her basket swinging lightly at her side, her gaze scanning the crowd for her suspects. Margaret Cole stood by the bookstall, flipping through a second-hand novel with an air of distracted superiority. Her auburn hair gleamed under the sunlight, but her face was drawn, her fingers gripping the book a touch too tightly. Victor Blaine was at the cider tent, laughing with a group of locals, his charm as polished as ever, though Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darted toward Margaret, as if wary of her presence. Timothy Grayson lingered near the edge of the green, his hands thrust into the pockets of his worn jacket, his expression sullen as he watched the festivities from afar. Eliza Dunn, meanwhile, was in her element, bustling between stalls with a basket of her own, pausing to whisper to anyone who would listen. Miss Marple made her way to the bookstall, where Margaret was now haggling over a tattered copy of Miss Cole, she said, her voice warm and unassuming. "How lovely to see you enjoying the fate. I was just thinking of poor Mr. Grayson's book. Such a pity we'll never read it." Margaret's head snapped up, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's, with a flash of irritation, quickly masked. "Yes, a pity," she said, her tone clipped. "It was a masterpiece, or would have been. Leonard had a way of cutting to the bone, too much so, perhaps." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle curiosity. "Cutting to the bone," she repeated. "What an apt phrase. I suppose his book must have stirred some unease with all those literary secrets. Margaret's smile was tight, her fingers crumpling the edge of the book. It was fiction, Miss Marple. People read too much into things. But yes, it was bold. Leonard didn't care who he offended. She glanced toward Victor, who was now laughing loudly at the cider tent, and her lips thinned. Some people might have taken it personally. Miss Marple followed her gaze, noting the tension in Margaret's posture. Mr. Blaine, perhaps, she said softly. I hear he was quite invested in the book's success. Margaret snorted, a sound unbecoming her polished exterior. Invested, he was counting the pounds before the ink was dry. But Leonard didn't trust him, not entirely. He thought Victor was too cozy with certain publishers. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, a gesture so subtle it might have been missed. She thought of a village accountant who had once juggled 2 sets of books, his charm hiding a web of deceit. Victor's financial troubles, she suspected, might have made him vulnerable to pressures beyond mere profit. Trust is such a fragile thing, she said. I suppose Mr. Grayson was careful about who saw his manuscript. Careful, Margaret said, her voice sharp. He was paranoid. Kept it locked in his desk. Wouldn't even let me have a full copy. I only saw drafts, brilliant drafts, mind you, but incomplete. She hesitated, then added, It's a shame. It would have changed everything. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing Margaret's words. The editor's frustration was palpable, but was it born of professional disappointment or something deeper? She thanked Margaret and moved on, her steps leading her toward the cider tent, where Victor was now alone, nursing a glass. Mr. Blaine, she called, her voice carrying the warmth of an old friend. You seem to be enjoying the fate. I was just speaking with Miss Cole about Mr. Grayson's book. Such a loss, don't you think? Victor's smile was quick, but his eyes were wary, like a man expecting a trap. A loss, yes, he said, setting his glass down. It was going to be a sensation. Publishers were practically begging for it. But Leonard was stubborn-kept, rewriting, delaying. Cost me a fortune in negotiations. Miss Marple's spectacles glinted as she tilted. Her head, how trying for you, she said. I hear the book was quite revealing. Secrets about the literary world, perhaps. Victor's laugh was too loud, drawing glances from nearby villagers. Secrets. It was a story, Miss Marple. Leonard had a vivid imagination. But yes, it was too sharp for some, maybe. He glanced toward Timothy, who was still lurking at the edge of the green, and his smile faded. Not that it matters now. It's all ashes. Miss Marple followed his gaze, noting the tension in his posture. Ashes, she said softly, but they leave traces. I wonder if anyone knew what was in those pages enough to want them destroyed. Victor's hand twitched, spilling a drop of cider. No one saw the full thing, he said quickly. Not me, not Margaret, not even his son. Leonard was like a dragon guarding treasure. Miss Marple smiled, her hands folded neatly in her basket. She thought of a village jeweler who had once hidden a stolen gem in plain sight, trusting his bluster. To deflect suspicion, Victor's insistence on his ignorance felt rehearsed, a shield for something he dared not admit. She thanked him and moved on, her eyes now on Timothy. The young man was leaning against a tree, his face half hidden by the collar of his jacket. Miss Marple approached, her basket swinging lightly. Timothy, she said, her voice gentle. You look quite lost out here. Won't you join the fete? There's a fine cake stall. Timothy's eyes flicked to her, his expression guarded. Not much for fates, he muttered. Just here because, well, I don't know why I'm here. Miss Marple's smile was sympathetic, though her mind was sharp. It's hard, being back after so long, she said. I was just thinking of your father's book. Did you know much about it? It seems to have been quite important. Timothy's jaw tightened, his hands clenching in his pockets. I didn't know anything, he said. He never talked to me about it. All I know is it was his life more than I ever was. Miss Marple noted the bitterness in his voice, the way his eyes avoided hers. She thought of a young man in St. Mary Mead who had once destroyed his father's will in a fit of rage, only to regret it when the truth came out. Timothy's resentment, she suspected, might have driven him to act or to know more than he claimed. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of Eliza Dunn, who was whispering to a group of women by the tombola. Miss Marple approached, her smile as warm as ever. Mrs. Dunn, you're the heart of this fate, she said. I was just thinking of Mr. Grayson's book. You must have heard so much, living so close. Eliza's eyes narrowed, but she smiled, her voice loud enough to carry. Oh, I heard bits and pieces. It was all secrets and scandals, they say, but I never saw it myself. Mr. Grayson wasn't one for sharing. Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the widow's quick denial. She recalled Eliza's vague tale of a shadow, her letter to Timothy, her watchful eyes. Secrets, she said softly, have a way of getting out, don't they? As the fate wound down, Miss Marple made her way home, her mind buzzing with the day's observations, Margaret's tension, Victor's nerves, Timothy's bitterness, and Eliza's evasions formed a pattern, but the manuscript was the key. She resolved to ask Inspector Craddock about the fragments found in the ashes perhaps. A single page held the truth. At her cottage, she lit the fire and sat by the window, her knitting untouched. A ghost, she murmured, can cast a long shadow, and this one, I think, will lead me to a murderer. Chapter 9. A Crack in the Facade, the St. Mary Mead. Village Hall was ablaze with light as the evening's charity auction drew a lively crowd, their chatter mingling with the clink of glasses and the auctioneer's brisk calls. Bric-a-brac and homemade preserves lined the tables, but Miss Jane Marple, seated near the back in her familiar tweed coat, was not here for the bidding. Her sharp eyes, hidden behind spectacles, scanned the room. Where the suspects in Leonard Grayson's murder had unwittingly gathered, Margaret Cole, Victor Blaine, Timothy Grayson, and Eliza Dunn. The auction, with its air of forced joviality, was the perfect stage for observing tensions that simmered beneath polite smiles. Miss Marple knew that people, when pressed by a crowd, often let their masks slip. She adjusted her scarf, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and watched as Margaret Cole stood near the front, bidding on a set of antique bookends with a determination that seemed excessive for such a modest prize. Victor Blaine lounged by the refreshment table, his charm turned on full as he chatted with the vicar's wife, though his glances toward Margaret were sharp and fleeting. Timothy Grayson hovered near the door, his hands thrust into his pockets, his sullen expression a stark contrast to the festive mood. Eliza Dunn, ever the busybody, flitted between groups, her floral apron swapped for a dress that was a touch too grand for the occasion. Miss Marple's mind was busy, weaving the threads of her previous encounters into a tighter pattern. Margaret's ambition, Victor's financial strain, Timothy's resentment, and Eliza's evasions all pointed to the manuscript, The Shadowed Path, a book whose secrets had sparked murder and arson. The missing gun remained her greatest puzzler, deliberate absence that suggested a calculated mind. She recalled a village scandal years ago, when a stolen locket had vanished from a crime scene, only to be found in a neighbor's attic. The gun, she suspected, was hidden somewhere close, waiting for a careful eye to find it. As the auctioneer called for bids on a chipped teapot, Miss Marple rose and made her way to the refreshment table, where Victor was pouring himself a glass. "Of punch, Mr. Blaine," she said, her voice warm and unassuming. "You're quite the fixture at our village events. I was just thinking of poor Mr. Grayson. His book must have been such a burden to you with all its delays." Victor's smile was quick, but his eyes flickered with unease. "A burden? Hardly, Miss Marple. It was a goldmine waiting to happen. Leonard just needed a push to finish it." He sipped his punch, his fingers tightening on the glass. "Shame it's all gone up in smoke." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle curiosity. "Indeed," she said. "I hear it was quite a revealing book. I was reading in the papers about a plagiarism scandal in London, some writer accused of borrowing too freely. It made me wonder if Mr. Grayson's book touched on such things." Victor's hand froze, the punch sloshing slightly. "Plagiarism," he said, his laugh a touch too loud. "Leonard, no, he was original to a fault. That book was all his own. Believe me." He glanced toward Margaret, who was now bidding fiercely on a painting, and his smile faded. "Some people might stir up trouble with talk like that, though." Miss Marple's spectacles glinted as she followed his gaze. "Trouble," she repeated softly. "Yes, books can cause that, can't they? Especially ones that expose secrets." She paused, then added, as if it were an afterthought, "I suppose you never saw the full manuscript, then? Only bits and pieces?" Victor's jaw tightened, and he set his glass down with a clink. "Bits and pieces, yes." Leonard was cagey. "Kept it locked up. I didn't need to read it all to know it was a winner." He excused himself abruptly, claiming a need to speak with the auctioneer, and Miss Marple watched him go, noting the stiffness in his stride. She moved next to Margaret, who had just won the painting a door landscape that seemed an odd choice for her polished taste. "Miss Cole," Miss Marple said, her voice as warm as a summer breeze, "you've quite an eye for art. I was just speaking with Mr. Blaine about Mr. Grayson's book. He seemed rather unsettled by the idea of plagiarism." Margaret's head snapped up, her cheeks paling beneath her rouge. "Plagiarism," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "That's nonsense. Leonard's work was original, every word. Victor would say anything to cover his own failures." She clutched the painting, her knuckles white, and excused herself to store it backstage. Her steps hurried, Miss Marple's lips pursed, her mind cataloguing the editor's reaction. Margaret's vehemence was telling, a crack in her carefully curated facade. She thought of a village schoolteacher who had once denied stealing exam answers, only to betray herself with a flushed face and a trembling voice. Margaret, she suspected, knew more about the manuscript's content than she admitted, perhaps a truth that threatened her own reputation. As the auction continued, Miss Marple's gaze settled on Timothy, still lingering by the door. She approached, her basket swinging lightly. "Timothy," she said, her tone gentle, "you're missing all the fun. I was just thinking of your father's book. It must be hard, knowing his work is lost." Timothy's eyes met hers, dark with something that might have been grief or guilt. "I don't care about his book," he said, his voice low and bitter. "It was all he ever cared about. Left me and Mother for it. If someone burned it, good riddance." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, though her expression remained sympathetic. "Such a strong feeling," she said. "I suppose you never knew what was in it. They say it was full of secrets, perhaps even about your family." Timothy's hands clenched in his pockets, and he looked away, his jaw tight. "I wouldn't know," he muttered. "I didn't come back for his secrets. I came because Mrs. Dunn said he was losing it. Thought I owed him a chance to explain himself." "Too late now?" Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the edge in his voice, the way he avoided her gaze. She thought of a young man in St. Mary Mead who had once destroyed a family portrait in a fit of rage, only to regret it when the truth of his father's love came to light. Timothy's bitterness, she suspected, might have driven him to act or to know more than he claimed. Finally, she approached Eliza Dunn, who was now gossiping with a group of women near the tambola. "Mrs. Dunn," Miss Marple said, her smile as warm as ever, "you're the life of this auction. I was just thinking of that night at Willow Cottage. You saw a shadow. You said someone moving in the dark." Eliza's eyes narrowed, but she laughed, a sound that rang false. "Oh, Miss Marple, you do go on. It was nothing, really just a trick of the light. I told the inspector all I know. Could have been anyone or no one." She turned back to her friends, dismissing the question with a wave. Miss Marple's smile did not waver, though her mind was sharp. Eliza's quick deflection, her insistence on vagueness, was a shield, much like the one a village gossip had once used to hide her role in a theft. The widow's letter to Timothy, her watchful eyes, her shifting story all pointed to a woman who knew more than she admitted. As the auction wound down, Miss Marple slipped out into the cool night, the village hall's lights fading behind her. She walked home slowly, her thoughts weaving the evening's observations into the larger pattern of the mystery. Margaret's pale face, Victor's unease, Timothy's bitterness, and Eliza's evasions were cracks in a facade, each revealing a glimpse of the truth. The manuscript, the shadowed path, was the key, its secrets dangerous enough to spark murder. But the missing gun, she decided, was the final piece of weapon hidden by a careful hand at her cottage. She lit the fire and sat by the window, her notebook open. She added a new line: "Plagiarism, fear Margaret or Victor." She underlined it, recalling the glint in Eliza's shed, the fragments in Grayson's grate. "A crack in the facade," she murmured, "is where the light gets in. And this light, I think, will show me a murderer." Chapter 10. The Agent's Confession. The air in St. Mary Mead carried a sharp bite as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the Red Lion in her black handbag clutched firmly, her steps purposeful despite the early morning chill. The village was still, waking, shop shutters rattling open, and the scent of fresh bread drifting from the bakery. Miss Marple's mind, however, was far from the village's daily rhythms. Her encounters with Margaret Cole, Timothy Grayson, and Eliza Dunn had tightened the threads of the mystery surrounding Leonard Grayson's murder. But it was Victor Blaine, the literary agent, whose nervous glances and flimsy alibi nagged at her most. She had decided to confront him, gently but firmly, in the hope that his polished charm might crack under the weight of her quiet persistence. The inn's lounge was quiet, its oak tables gleaming under the soft light of a single lamp. Victor sat alone in a corner, a half-empty glass of whiskey before him, his usually sleek appearance marred by a crumpled shirt and shadows under his eyes. He looked up as Miss Marple approached, his smile flickering like a candle in a draught. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice striving for its usual warmth but falling short. "You're up early. Care for a tea?" Or is this another of your village chats? She settled into the chair opposite, her expression as serene as a Sunday morning. Tea would be lovely, Mr. Blaine, but I'm here for more than a chat. I've been thinking about poor Mr. Grayson and his book. It's such a puzzle, isn't it? A manuscript burned, a man shot, and no gun to be found. I thought you might help me understand it better. Victor's fingers tightened on his glass, his smile fading. I've told you what I know, he said, a touch too quickly. Leonard was stubborn, kept the book to himself. It's all ashes now, so what's the use of talking about it? Miss Marple tilted her head, her spectacles catching the lamplight. Oh, but ashes can tell a story, Mr. Blaine, she said softly. I've been thinking about what you said at the fete, how the book was a gold mine, but Leonard was cagey. You saw parts of it, didn't you? Enough to know it was dangerous. Victor's laugh was brittle, like dry leaves underfoot. Dangerous. It was a novel, Miss Marple. Fiction, you're making it sound like a conspiracy. He took a sip of whiskey, his hand trembling slightly, betraying the nerves his words tried to conceal. She leaned forward, her voice gentle but unyielding, like a needle threading through fabric. Fiction can cut deeper than truth. Mr. Blaine, I was reading in the papers about a plagiarism, scandalsome writer borrowing from another's work. It made me wonder if the shadowed path touched on something similar, something that might have made someone desperate. Victor's face paled, his eyes darting to the door as if hoping for an escape. Plagiarism, he said, his voice rising. That's nonsense. Leonard was original. I told you that. He set his glass down with a clink. The sound sharp in the quiet room. Miss Marple's smile remained, but her eyes were as sharp as her knitting needles. She thought of a village tailor who had once denied stealing a bolt of cloth, his protests growing louder as the evidence mounted. Victor's defensiveness, she sensed, was a shield for a deeper truth. Of course, she said, but you did see parts of the manuscript, didn't you? Perhaps you recognized something, a story, a phrase that wasn't quite Leonard's. Own Victor's shoulders slumped, and for a moment he looked like a man caught in a trap of his own making. He ran a hand through his hair, his charm crumbling like old plaster. All right, Miss Marple, he said, his voice low and hoarse. You're too clever by half. Yes, I saw parts of the book. And yes, there was something familiar about it. A plot, a character, nothing blatant, but it reminded me of an old novel I'd represented years ago. A flop, barely sold a dozen copies. I thought no one would notice. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, though her expression remained serene. And you suggested this plot to Mr. Grayson? She asked, her tone as mild as if she were discussing the weather. Victor nodded, his eyes fixed on the table. I didn't think it was a big deal. The book was dead, forgotten. I gave Leonard the idea, just to get him started. He was stuck, needed a push. But he got suspicious, started asking questions, digging into old contracts. A week ago, he confronted me at the cottage, said he'd found the original novel, knew I'd fed him the plot. He was furious, said he'd rewrite it all, expose me in the new version. Miss Marple's mind raced, fitting this confession into the pattern of the mystery. Victor's admission explained the manuscript's danger, not just to literary figures, but to him personally. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead when a grocer had passed off cheap tea as premium, only to be caught when a customer recognized the blend. Victor's plagiarism, she suspected, was the spark that led to murder. And so, she said, her voice soft but probing. "You went to Willow Cottage that night, didn't you? To reason with him?" Victor's head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. "I didn't mean to kill him," he blurted, his voice breaking. "I went to talk, to make him see sense." He was at his desk, waving that manuscript like it was a weapon. We argued. It got heated. He grabbed a gun from his drawer, said he'd protect his work at all costs. I panicked, wrestled it from him. It went off. "I didn't mean it, I swear." He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Miss Marple's expression softened, though her mind remained sharp. "And the fire?" she asked gently, "to destroy the manuscript?" Victor nodded, his voice muffled. "I couldn't let it get out. Not after he'd found the truth. I grabbed the pages, stuffed them in the grate, used the lamp oil to set it alight. I thought it would look like an accident. I took the gun, ran. I didn't know what else to do." Miss Marple sat back, her hands folded in her lap. Victor's confession was a flood, but she sensed it was not the whole river. The gun's absence still troubled her. Why take it, only to hide it? She thought of a village boy who had once confessed to stealing apples, omitting the fact that he'd sold them for profit. Victor, she suspected, was holding something back, perhaps to protect himself or another. "You've been very honest, Mr. Blaine," she said, her tone kind but firm. "But the gun, where is it now?" "It wasn't found at the cottage." Victor's head jerked up, his eyes wide with fear. I got rid of it," he stammered. "Threw it in the river on my way back to the inn. It's gone, Miss Marple. You have to believe me." She nodded, though her mind was already turning to the glint she had seen in Eliza Dunn's shed. A river was a convenient excuse, but Victor's panic suggested he knew more about the gun's fate. She rose, smoothing her coat. "You've given me much to think about, Mr. Blaine," she said. "I'll speak with Inspector Craddock. He'll want to hear this, I'm sure." Victor grabbed her arm, his grip desperate. "Please, Miss Marple, it was an accident. I didn't mean to hurt him. You won't tell anyone, will you?" She gently extricated herself, her smile unwavering. "The truth has a way of coming out, Mr. Blaine," she said, "but I'll be discreet. For now, rest. You look as though you need it." As she left the inn, the morning sun was breaking through the clouds, casting long shadows across the village. Miss Marple walked slowly, her thoughts weaving Victor's confession into the larger pattern. His admission explained the murder and the fire, but the gun's whereabouts remained a puzzle. She recalled Eliza Dunn's shifting stories, her letter to Timothy, her watchful eyes. Had she seen Victor that night and taken the gun to protect him more, to use it against him? At her cottage, Miss Marple lit the fire and opened her notebook, adding a new entry. "Victor confesses plagiarism, motive, but gun, Eliza." She underlined it, her mind circling the widow's shed, the glint among the nettles. "A confession," she murmured, "is only half the truth. The other half lies in what's still hidden." She resolved to visit Inspector Craddock that afternoon to urge a search of Eliza's property. For now, she sat by the window, the fire's warmth settling her thoughts. Victor's mask had cracked, but the mystery was not yet solved. A guilty man runs, she thought, but a clever one hides, and I shall find what's hidden in time. Chapter 11. The final piece. The afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, painting the village in shades of gold and amber as Miss Jane Marple made her way back to Eliza Dunn's cottage. Her black handbag swung lightly at her side, but her mind, was heavy with the weight of Victor Blaine's confession. His admission of killing Leonard Grayson and burning the manuscript explained much. Yet the missing gun gnawed at her like a dropped stitch in a carefully knitted shawl. Victor's claim of throwing it into the river felt too convenient, and Miss Marple's thoughts kept circling back to the glint she had glimpsed in Eliza's shed, half hidden among the nettles. She had learned long ago that loose ends, however small, often unraveled the tightest lies. Eliza's cottage looked as pristine as ever, its whitewashed walls gleaming, its garden a model of order save for that neglected corner by the shed. Miss Marple knocked, her knuckles firm but polite, and Eliza appeared promptly, her grey curls pinned tightly, her apron crisp as if she had been expecting company. Her small, bird-like eyes narrowed at the sight of her visitor, though she forced a smile. Miss Marple twice in 1 week. Eliza exclaimed, her voice a touch too bright. To what do I owe the pleasure? More jam, perhaps? Oh, no, Mrs. Dunn, I shan't trouble you long, Miss Marple said, her tone as warm as a summer breeze. I was passing and thought I'd see how you're faring. The village is still abuzz about poor Mr. Grayson, and I know how close you were to it all. Eliza's smile tightened, and she gestured Miss Marple inside, her movements brisk. Close, yes, too close for comfort, she said, leading the way to the parlour. That fire lit up the whole lane. I'm still shaking, thinking of it. She busied herself with the tea tray, her hands fluttering like nervous birds. Miss Marple settled into the same pristine armchair as before, her eyes drifting to the window with its clear view of Willow Cottage. It must have been dreadful, she said, her voice soft but probing. You mentioned seeing a shadow that night, someone moving near the cottage. I've been thinking about it, and it occurs to me you might have seen more than you realized. Eliza's hands paused on the teapot, her cheeks flushing. I told you, Miss Marple, it was just a shadow. Hard to say in the dark. I'm not one for making up stories. She poured the tea with a clatter, her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's. Of course not, Miss Marple said, her smile unwavering. But you have such a keen eye, Mrs. Dunn. I was thinking of that shed in your garden, such a useful place for storing things. I couldn't help noticing it looked a bit neglected. Nettles, you know, can hide all sorts of surprises. Eliza's cup rattled in its saucer, and she set it down abruptly. My shed, she said, her voice sharp. It's just full of old tools, nothing more. I don't see what that's got to do with anything. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind as sharp as the needles in her bag. She thought of a village widow who had once hidden stolen silver in her coal shed, thinking no one would look there. Eliza's defensiveness, her quick dismissal of the shed, was a telltale sign. Oh, I'm sure it's nothing, Miss Marple said, her tone light. But I was speaking with Mr. Blaine this morning, and he mentioned something curious about the night of the fire. It made me wonder if you might have seen him leaving the cottage. Eliza's face paled, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. Mr. Blaine, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what you mean. I told the inspector everything. Miss Marple tilted her head, her spectacles glinting. Did you, Mrs. Dunn? You wrote to Timothy, you said, out of concern for his father. And you saw a shadow that night, perhaps Mr. Blaine, perhaps not. But if you saw him leave, and if he dropped something, well, a neighbour as watchful as you might have picked it up, to keep it safe, of course. Eliza stood abruptly, her hands trembling. You're talking nonsense, Miss Marple, she snapped. I didn't pick up anything. I didn't see anything. You've no right to come here, poking into my business. Miss Marple remained seated, her expression serene but unyielding. I'm not poking, Mrs. Dunn, she said softly. I'm trying to understand. A man is dead, his work destroyed, and a gun is missing. If someone found that gun, say, in their garden, or shed it, would be best to tell the truth now, before the police start looking. Eliza's eyes widened, and for a moment she looked like a cornered animal, her breath coming in short gasps. Then, as if a dam had broken, she sank back into her chair, her face crumpling. I didn't mean any harm, she whispered. I saw him, Victor Blaine, running from the cottage that night. The fire was starting, just a glow in the window. I went to look, after the brigade came, and I found it in the hedger gun, still warm. I took it, hid it in the shed. I thought I could use it, maybe get something from him. He's got money, or so he acts. Miss Marple's lips pursed, though her expression remained kind. Blackmail, Mrs. Dunn, she said gently. That's a dangerous game. You kept the gun to protect Mr. Blaine or to profit from him. Eliza's hands twisted in her lap, her voice barely audible. I didn't know he'd killed him, not at first. I just thought, a man like that, always flashing his charm, he'd pay to keep it quiet. I needed the money, my pension's not enough, but I didn't shoot anyone, Miss Marple, I swear. Miss Marple nodded, her mind fitting this final piece into the puzzle. Victor's confession had explained the murder and the fire, but Eliza's role clarified the gun's fate. She thought of a village shopkeeper who had once kept stolen goods, hoping to sell them later, only to be caught when her greed outpaced her caution. Eliza's opportunism, she suspected, had turned her from witness to accomplice. You've been very honest, Mrs. Dunn, Miss Marple said, rising and smoothing her coat. I'll speak with Inspector Craddock. He'll need to see that gun, you know. It's evidence in a murder. Eliza's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, her shoulders sagging. It's in the shed, she said. Under the old sacks, wrapped in a cloth. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch light but firm. The truth is always the best course, my dear, she said. It saves so much trouble in the end. She left the cottage and walked briskly to the police station, where Inspector Craddock was sorting through reports. He looked up as she entered, his expression a mix of exasperation and respect. Miss Marple, he said, I should have known you'd be back. What's it this time? She smiled, her handbag clasped before her. Just a small matter, Inspector. You might want to look in Mrs. Dunn's shed, under some sacks, I believe. You'll find Mr. Grayson's missing gun, and you'll want to speak with Mr. Blaine, against he's told me quite a story. Craddock's eyebrows shot up, but he reached for his hat. You never cease to amaze me, he said. I'll send a constable to the shed and bring Blaine in. Care to tell me what he said? Miss Marple recounted Victor's confession, her voice calm but precise, and Eliza's admission about the gun. Craddock listened, shaking his head. Plagiarism and blackmail, he muttered. All for a book. I'll have them both in custody by tonight. As Miss Marple left the station, the village was settling into dusk, the lights of the cottages glowing like stars. She thought of the manuscript, its secrets now buried in ashes, and the greed that had driven two people to destroy it. Man's life. Greed, she murmured, makes strange allies, but it always leaves a trace. At her cottage, she lit the fire and opened her notebook, crossing out the final question, where is the gun? The mystery was nearly solved. But she felt no triumph, only a quiet satisfaction that the truth had emerged. She sat by the window, her knitting untouched, and watched the village settle into night. One last thread, she thought, and the pattern is complete. Chapter 12. The embers settle. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of the village's thatched roofs and stone walls as Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlour window, her knitting needles clicking in a steady rhythm. The fire crackled softly in the grate, casting a warm glow across the room, but her thoughts were far from the scarf taking shape in her hands. The events of the past days, Victor Blaine's confession, Eliza Dunn's admission, and the recovery of the gun had unravelled the mystery of Leonard Grayson's murder. Yet Miss Marple felt the quiet melancholy that often followed a case's resolution. Truth, she knew, brought justice but seldom joy. The village was abuzz with the news of Victor's arrest. Inspector Craddock had acted swiftly, retrieving the gun from Eliza's Cheddar revolver, cleaned but still bearing traces of the fatal shatan, taking both Victor and Eliza into custody. Victor, broken by his own confession, had repeated his story to the police. How his suggestion of a plagiarized plot for the shadowed path had led to a confrontation with Grayson, a struggle, and a fatal shot fired in panic. The fire, he admitted, was a desperate attempt to destroy the evidence of his deceit. Eliza, meanwhile, had confessed to hiding the gun, her greed for blackmail money, turning her from a nosy neighbour into an accomplice after the fact. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose to pour a cup of tea from the pot on the sideboard. As she sipped, her sharp blue eyes drifted to the notebook on her table, its pages filled with the names and motives that had guided her to the truth. Margaret Cole's ambition, while fierce, had been innocent of murder. Her frustration stemmed from a lost opportunity, not guilt. Timothy Grayson's resentment, though deep, had not driven him to kill. His return was a failed attempt at reconciliation, spurred by Eliza's letter. Victor's desperation and Eliza's opportunism, however, had formed a deadly alliance, one born of fear and greed. She thought of a village scandal years ago, when a greedy clerk and a meddling housekeeper had conspired to hide a theft, only to be undone by their own mistrust. Victor and Eliza, she mused, were not so different. Each had acted to protect their own interests, only to entangle themselves further. The manuscript, the shadowed path, had been the spark, its secrets threatening to expose Victor's plagiarism and ruin his career. Miss Marple's lips pursed as she recalled the glint in Eliza's shed, the final clue that had tied the widow to the crime. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Mrs. Dolly Bantry, her old friend, bundled in a coat and scarf, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Jane, you've done it again," Dolly exclaimed, settling into a chair with a rustle of wool. "The whole village is talking about Victor Blaine and Eliza Dunn, murder and blackmail, right next door. I want every detail." Miss Marple smiled, offering a cup of tea. "Oh, Dolly, it's a sad business, really," she said, her voice soft. "People are so predictable, you know. They destroy what they fear, but the truth has a way of surviving, even in ashes." She recounted the case in her quiet, unassuming way, beginning with the fire at Willow Cottage and the bullet in Grayson's chest. She described Margaret's ambition, Victor's debts, Timothy's bitterness, and Eliza's nosiness, each a thread in the pattern she had unravelled. Victor feared exposure, she said, and Eliza saw a chance to profit. But they forgot that secrets leave traceus in a grate, a glint in a shed, a trembling hand. Dolly leaned forward, her eyes wide. And the manuscript, was it really so dangerous? Miss Marple nodded, her spectacles glinting in the firelight. Dangerous enough to kill for, she said. Inspector Craddock found a fragment in the Ashes, single page, scorched but legible. It mentioned a character, a literary agent who passed off another's work as his own. Victor recognized himself, I'm sure, and panicked. The rest of the book, I suspect, held more such truths, thinly veiled. Dolly gasped, clutching her teacup. And it's all gone now. What a loss. Not entirely, Miss Marple said, a faint smile playing on her lips. That fragment was enough to interest a publisher, Craddock knows. They're talking of printing it as a memorial to Grayson, with Timothy's blessing. His legacy will live on, in a way. Dolly shook her head, marveling. You're a wonder, Jane. How do you see these things? I'd have thought it was an accident, like the police did at first. Miss Marple's needles resumed their clicking, the rhythm as steady as her thoughts. People are like knitting, Dolly, she said. They follow a pattern, even when they think they're being clever. You just have to watch for the dropped stitches, the lies, the glances, the things they don't say. Dolly laughed, rising to leave. Well, you've stitched this one up neatly. The village owes you again, though they'll never know it. As the door closed behind her friend, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her mind settling like the embers in the grate. The mystery of the shadowed path was solved, its secrets laid bare, but she felt no triumph, only a quiet satisfaction. She thought of Leonard Grayson, alone at his typewriter, pouring his life into a book that became his undoing. Poor man, she murmured. He wrote the truth, and it burned him. Outside, the mist had lifted, revealing the village in sharp relief cottages glowing with lamplight, the church spire piercing the sky. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the horizon, where Willow Cottage stood, its scars hidden by the dusk. She thought of the page that had survived, a fragment of Grayson's voice that would speak again. Even ashes tell a story, she said softly, if you know how to listen. Her needles clicked on, the scarf growing longer, its pattern as intricate and deliberate as the mystery she had unravelled. St. Mary Mead would sleep soundly tonight, its secrets safe for now, but Miss Marple knew that human nature, like her knitting, would always have another knot to untangle,